So welcome to this evening's National Tree Week event. This is, as part of this week, we've got a theme running, which is Hidden Connections. And so we've got some workshops this week in the evenings on roots and root fungi to try and explore some of that, My name's John Stokes. I'm Director of Trees Scicence and Research here at the Tree Council. And I'd like to introduce Sharon Durdant-Hollamby, who's with me this evening. Sharon is, well, I first met Sharon 22 years ago when we were both mere children in the tree world, getting started. And Sharon was then at Chelmsford, where she was coordinating a tree warden network as part of her first job, but she's gone on to great things now. She became a consultant. She specialises in tree roots, which is why we thought she'd be the perfect person to talk this evening. But she's also become the president of the Institute of Chartered Foresters, which is one of the key organisations for pulling together people across the sector. And she has an amazing podcast series as well called Tree Lady Talks, which I would recommend to all of you to go and have a listen to. So we're going to talk this evening about tree roots. And I thought we would start with a little bit of context. So I'm just going to put a few slides up to just give you a little bit of context on this evening and on what we're trying to do. But we thought we would just explain before we started about National Tree Week and the Tree Council. So the Tree Council is the national charity that works together for the love of trees, basically. And we have a whole range of activity that goes on under 4 threads: community action, young learning, practical science and research, and partnership. And we're really the organisation that specialises in the non-woodland. So our history comes from the fact that we used to work alongside the Forestry Commission. They were the department that dealt with forests. We were the agency that dealt with the non-woodland world. And we had a partnership of organisations that came together to do a whole range of stuff for trees. And some of you that are old enough, but I'm sure not many of you, because I'm sure you're all very young this evening, might remember Plant a Tree in 73. Plant a Tree in 73 was where the Tree Council started. Suddenly Sharon seems to have disappeared from my screen. Don, is that? Oh, she's back. Plant a Tree in 73 is where the organisation started. Plant Some More in 74 was part of that story, but that was when the Tree Council really started. We launched National Tree Week during that period. And then we set up the Tree Wardens that I referred to earlier, a network of volunteers back in 1990. 2000 was our 30th anniversary of tree wardening, and I've had the privilege of working at the Tree Council for that whole period over those 30 years, which has been great fun. And next year we'll see that 50th anniversary of all our activities, because it's the start of Plant a Tree in 73. And I even planted my first tree back in 1973 with my dad. So it really goes very deep with me. But the world has changed over those 50 years. And now we have all sorts of huge national aspirations and targets for tree planting. And just to give you some of those ideas, some of the things that we're now talking about trees for is for nature recovery, for climate change mitigation, to help people in towns and cities to have better air, cleaner air, more interesting things to look at, to deal with heritage and landscape. But we also have this massive issue of net zero going on around the country, the idea of trying to become carbon neutral. And to achieve that, we've got to plant 30,000 hectares of trees every year, which is the target that's been set. And also, we're going to extend our hedges by about 40%, which is another 200,000 kilometres of hedges. To put that into real hard numbers, that means we've got to plant between 70 and 125 million more trees per year across the UK, every year for the next 30 years to meet those targets. So that's an awful lot of trees that have to be planted. And we have to do that in a way that ensures that they survive. That's the key bit. And the key bit to do this is that we're going to have to think a bit more about the ground preparation. We're going to have to think about how we prepare for the trees, and particularly for their roots. and do all sorts of experimentation and better practice and all sorts of things to think, how can we get those trees to survive? Because I think it's probably true for most people that the only time you think about roots is in that few seconds between taking them out of the bag or taking them out of the pot or taking them out of the water and before you put them in the ground. And then once you've planted them in the ground, many people just forget about the roots that they've planted. And this evening and this week, we kind of try and ensure that you understand a bit more about the roots so that you think, differently about roots. And that's what we're trying to do this evening. So, roots are amazing structures, and Sharon's going to talk later about some of her experiences working on tree roots over the last 20 years. But they are amazing structures. Sometimes it's brought to your attention. You see amazing sets of roots across the ground. And then you see trees like this, and you can't help but wonder, what's the history of that tree? What was going on? Why are all those roots there on the surface? What could they tell me if they could talk? Because they are a really important part of the life of the tree. We just don't see them, so we don't necessarily think of them. And certainly as a tree person for 30 years, I still find it amazing that we're learning stuff all the time about tree roots. And so later on this week, we're going to be exploring in much greater detail. Sharon's going to touch on it later, but the connections, some of the underground connections. And I love this. This was an experiment done in the States where they put one tree inside a netting structure, and they injected it with radiocarbon 14. Carbon 14 is a radioactive compound. And then they put another tree just away from it in shade so that it wasn't photosynthesizing. And they tracked how long it took the carbon 14 from the one tree to get to the other. And they realized that it did. It was really quite rapid, and it was happening by the network of roots and mycorrhizae. And the mycorrhizae are the fungi that attach to the roots and are acting as a sort of web of distribution under the ground. And Sharon's going to touch on this, but we have Professor Martin Bidotando, who's going to be talking about this on Thursday night. And we'll put a link in if you're interested in coming to find out more about that on Thursday. But roots are truly amazing. The largest root system that we've got on the planet is probably this. It's an aspen tree called Pando in the United States. And this is 47,000 genetically identical aspen trees, which all come off one root. And that one root has spread over probably 10,000 years. Well, not as long as, potentially as long as 10,000 years, because every tree is the same. So it is an area of 106 acres of root that spreads across this area. That is just one root system, and that's mind-boggling when you think about it. The deepest root on the planet, we often talk about where do roots go, and Sharon's going to talk about this in a minute. Where do roots go? Well, the deepest root on the planet is 400 feet down in a cave in South Africa. It has gone down an extraordinary distance. It's called Echo Caves, and this here is the root that's gone all the way down 400 feet into the ground. I mean, that's astonishing that a root can travel down there to get to water. They will find it if it's there. But not all roots are in the ground. Some of them are aerial. And these are, in Australia, these are the roots of a strangler fig. And these start in the canopy of a tree. A bird drops a seed and the roots then grow, strangling the tree it's on, getting down to the ground, so that eventually they become the tree. The thing it was on gets crushed and suffocated inside, and sometimes even ceases to be because it's surrounded by this root. So there are amazing root structures out there on the planet, and even sometimes you can see these sorts of roots in trees in Britain. This is internal roots, aerial roots in an old yew tree that have been in and recycled the middle of the tree. And this one I still find fascinating. This is in St Albans. It's a single aerial root that's come down from the canopy and grown down and got to the ground, helping this tree to have a bit of stability, getting some extra nutrients. but I've never seen anything like this one anywhere else on a tree in the UK. So roots are astonishing, and we thought we would touch on that. And I'm closing my bit by just saying the thing that really still blows my mind is that roots even appear to be able to hear water, listen to water. And they've done experiments now playing the sound of roots, sorry, the sound of water, and even having real water. And tree roots and other roots grow towards the water. And more amazingly, even most amazingly, they can actually tell the difference between a recording and real water. So it's probably one of the reasons that roots head for drains, because they can hear the vibrations of the water in the pipes, and therefore they head there. I mean, why wouldn't you if the water's there? So roots are astonishing things. It's something we haven't done enough about thinking about over the years. And tonight we hope that'll start the journey. And I'm now going to pass to Sharon, who, as I say, has spent a lot of her working career on roots and is probably one of the most experienced root people I've ever met. So she's going to talk to you about roots as she sees it. Sharon, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, John. Just to shatter any illusions, I am a tree consultant, so I'm not a scientist, but I am going to start off talking a little bit about biology, and I look forward to your questions at the end. But thank you so much for inviting me, everybody. I'm now going to share my screen. Always a moment of trepidation.
Well, you saw from me, Sharon, that it doesn't always work in practice. So
how does that look?
That looks perfect.
Great. Bear with me while I just drag the screen across here. Great, lovely. Well, I'm just going to move something over here. That's all good. So we're exploring hidden connections, and I'm guessing that everybody here loves trees, but half the tree is underground, and it's often misunderstood or at worst completely forgotten, especially on a building site. But trees are really brilliant biomechanically optimized beings in harmony with the roots and the crown, taking up what they need to be healthy, to grow, to reproduce and repair. And they do not grow where they don't need to grow. They don't waste any resources. And really, they are quite intelligent in a way. Charles Darwin considered that roots are the brain of the tree. But what is a tree root? Well, tree roots are amazing. John used that word, and I can't help using it again. Not only do they keep the tree upright, but they really adapt to their surroundings. And with most trees, in terms of their morphology, they're obviously thicker near the trunk, and they quickly taper to a subdivision of roots as thick as my finger. And from that is a myriad of fine feeder roots. And from that, a huge connection of mycorrhizae working together in harmony with microorganisms. And we're just beginning, I think, to scratch the surface of what's actually going on with what I believe is a really important ecosystem. I mean, nature has been doing a great job for a really long time, but just recently, perhaps man has not been doing the most helpful things. So now more than ever, we need to understand what makes roots work, because trees are definitely part of the solution to climate change. Just a little bit of biology, really. So at the germination stage, the juvenile root, or the radicle, breaks through the seed coating, driven by hormones, and goes straight down. And this is really how lots of people think that a tree root is. It's one big taproot, but the opposite is true. Because as this tree root grows down, it gets sloughed off by rough soil and stones. And then you get this lateral root system going off to the side. And such is our way that we want to classify everything. And there are various root form classifications, such as heart root and taproot and surface roots. But really, it's my personal view that this says more about our need to classify and control rather than observe. And I've found, looking over the last 20 to 30 years, that roots are highly variable depending on where they're growing. In fact, it's more nurture by site conditions than just nature. But what does a tree root look like and how does it grow? Well, the business part of the tree is really the meristematic zone. So this is this area here. So this is a slice through a tree root as it's growing. This bit here is a quiescent center. That's really, I wouldn't say thinking part because that would be too simplistic and probably not correct, but that is a real important zone of activity. And this is protected by the root cap, which is a series of jelly-like cells which produce this mucky gel so that it helps the root as it pushes down, forced by hormones, exploring the soil. It protects that very sensitive end from being knocked off and damaged. In fact, when there's a drought, this mucky gel gets even thicker. Around the outside of the root are these root hairs, and these root hairs are sort of brittle and they spiral out around the root to try and explore as much area as possible. And then you get these emerging lateral roots, so it's growing down and it's growing out. But generally, it's these sort of white tip ends that are doing the business of getting water and nutrients. So looking at this in cross section, we have the steel in the center. This is really the pipeline. So this is where the water comes up from the soil in the xylem with the solutes up to the tree. And then coming down the other way through the phloem are the metabolites to roots from photosynthesis. And this is protected by a Caspian strip. And this really controls the amount of water going in and out of this system, a sort of self-regulator. And outside of this, it's much more spongy, and water and nutrients are absorbed into this area and used by the roots. But what makes roots brown? Well, it's actually tannins. So you think about the tannin in oak bark. This is the tannin to sort of protect it in some ways, a sort of corky layer. And it is possible to get water and nutrients through this layer, but mostly it's through the white tip and through these very fine hairs. So that's your biology lesson there. But healthy tree needs healthy soil. You've probably heard this before, but 1 teaspoon of soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. And that's a really complex mixture of probably about 100 million bacteria, hundreds of meters of fine fungal threads, nematodes, protozoa, anthropods, and earthworms. It's incredible. No wonder my tea tasted funny. But that's a healthy soil. And we've been doing stuff to soil in the last 100 years and actually changing the ecology of it, and not always in a beneficial way. And for example, you may have heard of rewilding and the NEP project. Well, a dear friend of mine, Ted Green, who I hope you've heard of, went to NEP, and the owners asked him prior to rewilding, what's wrong with our oak trees? And Ted said, actually, it's the soil. It's all the stuff put on the soil, and it's sort of ruining the ecosystem underneath. So the trees are suffering. So essentially, everything we do to the soil is going to affect the trees. And our urban soils are also very impoverished, but there are things that we can do about that. So where do they grow? Well, tree roots need to carry out gaseous exchange, essentially an airflow. They carry out respiration. So they will absorb oxygen from the ground and give out carbon dioxide, the opposite of what the crown does. And they also need water to function, and they need to be able to grow freely. So the soil is normally looser. You probably know this from digging up, but the top sort of 0.5 meter to 1 meter is generally much looser, more friable than harder ground underneath. And tree roots, they don't want to try too hard. They're just going to grow freely through that upper level of soil. So it makes sense that most tree roots are in the top 600 to 900 millimeters, or about 1 meter or so. And this is what literature tells us, and this is what I've found mostly. There are exceptions. So what you'll generally see are all the thicker roots near the tree trunk, and these fine feeder roots, which I talked about earlier, they only really live for a short time, anywhere between a few days to a year or so, and they really grow where they have a good time. So where the going is good, you'll see this fairly quick proliferation of these fine roots. But if the ground condition changes, maybe the tree becomes shaded or drier, or something's placed on the root plate, or there's a change, they will die off. But even those dead roots are useful. They're kind of recycled and a source for this wonderful ecosystem underneath, and a source of carbon. So literally nothing is wasted. And there's an analogy that I quite like, is that tree roots are a bit like a glass of wine. So with everything going on in that stem base, supporting, maybe spreading out to the plate. If the glass of wine was on a plate, it's that sort of analogy which keeps it stable. But they do vary. And in challenging situations, they will be deeper. They will be asymmetric. They will seek what they need to find, and they will adapt. But where do they grow? So in an open ground, tree roots will grow fairly evenly and normally out much further than the crown. And so they can get as much as possible. So if there are no obstructions, it's a fairly uniform pattern. But trees are social beings, and they benefit from being together, just like we do, especially in a woodland. And groups or lines of trees thrive as their roots share resources and exchange nutrients. There is literally strength in numbers, but they don't do this alone, which is why our understanding of the wood wide web is helping us care better for trees and plan more effectively for new planting. And importantly, it captures people's imaginations. We should not see trees as green lollipops to sweeten our streets, but as complex social beings with the important stuff happening beneath our feet. So John spoke earlier about mycorrhizae, and I really am going to defer to Professor Martin Bidatondo, who's going to on his Trees and Fungi Working Together workshop on Thursday. But just to touch on it, because it's just so interesting. The wood wide web is the essence of the forest, whether natural or urban. People talk about removing it for infrastructure projects, removing a forest and replacing it. It's not just the trees are just part of it. The mycorrhizae fungus is a broad and diverse family, and they grow either in the root or around the root, and they connect plants to each other and create this massive web. Now, the mycorrhizae fungi has a brain-like tip, and analogies can be made when they're put under a microscope to our neural pathways in the brain, with underused areas dying off. For example, my schoolgirl French was completely gone, and new areas growing with use. It's very similar with mycorrhizae fungi. And the way it works is that trees trade food with the fungus. They give the fungus some of their sugar, to put it simply, while the fungus's fat increases the rooting area so it can better soak up water and nutrients. And it's a really good pathway to phosphorus and some of the other macronutrients that the tree needs. But it all depends on healthy soil, as I said earlier. So water and nutrients flow through the system, enabling the trees to share resources. But it's more than that. This fungal network grows in many different directions at once, sprawling out as a massive entity, yet keeping in touch with itself. It's hard to explain because I think this is such new, exciting science, but it's more thought of as a thing and not a process. I'll give you an example. We put food in our bodies, but the mycelium, the fungus, puts its body in the food. and their lives are flooded with sensory information, and we're limited by our own small brains to really understand everything so far. And there is opinion divided over cognition. One of the early pioneers of this field was Dr. Suzanne Simard, and she really looked at connection and carried out experiments using lots of different methods, such as John mentioned. And recent research by Dr. Toby Keir in Amsterdam finds that the relationship is dynamic, depending on changing resources and needs. And it's a sliding scale between some of them being quite parasitic and the other end being real cooperative mutualism. Everybody really likes this I speak to, and it's really tempting to think of this as utopia, as a model for life. But are we being a bit sentimental? Are we putting our own values on what's happening under the ground? But it is happening. You know, it has been proven. So we can take this example here of a fir tree and a birch tree. So in the winter, the fir tree is just about ticking over photosynthesizing, whereas a birch tree, let's say we've moved now to say February here in the UK, the birch tree roots are just beginning to sort of wake up a little bit after winter, and it needs a real shot of energy to push up, to burst those buds, which is a real time of energy stress for a tree. So the fir tree will just give the birch tree a boost. And conversely, in the summer, when the tree canopies, when the trees are in leaf, the fir tree is struggling a little bit, it's in shade. So the birch tree will return the favour. But not only does the mycorrhizal network enable trees to share these resources, but also to send messages between the trees via chemical or electronic chatter. Now, it's marvellously fanciful to think about emails being sent on the World Wide Web, and it's easy to get carried away. There's certainly a lot of work to do. And also, we don't really know yet, are the trees and the fungi actively sending messages or information, or is it a chemical spillover? Is it indeed a happy accident? But why bother? Here's an example. When an insect eats a leaf, let's say an oak leaf, the tree risks losing its photosynthetic area. A massive insect attack, which you sometimes see, like the gypsy moth, can completely defoliate a tree and cause enormous stress in the summer. So the oak tree will put out bad chemicals to make the leaf taste quite unpleasant. You may say, why not have that on all the time? But the fact is, it's quite expensive for the tree to use the energy to have that chemical on all the time. So when the caterpillar's on the leaf, munching away, the oak tree will put out this chemical, and it spreads in the air to the other oaks, and also is carried a little bit slower down the tree into the root system through the mycorrhizae fungal network to tell its fellow oaks, its family. Remember, together we are stronger. It's protecting its family. So, and trees, I've learned, can even take this a step further. They can actually sense the saliva of a particular species of insect and turn on a tailor-made cocktail. That's amazing. But tree roots, that's a sort of basic, but they do adapt to their site. So here's some roots I dug up in Montpellier in France that were growing on stone. So this is a pine tree, and there were street trees, and they were literally on top of rocks. And I just love these weird cushions, which is where the tree roots are cupped over the stone. You see, this stuff is happening all over, and we just don't see it. When you dig up, you can have some fun. So this was a perfectly happy pine tree with this adaptation. Another more commonly seen adaptation are pneumatophores, or knees, as I like to call them, because I can't say pneumatophores very well. But some species who live near water, like mangroves and swamp cypress, lodgepole pine, they have modified root tissues. So what's actually going on is that there's extensive air spaces between the cells. that allow oxygen to diffuse from the well-aerated tissues higher in the stem into the roots, and it allows the diffusion of carbon dioxide and toxins. It's a wonderful nature adaptation. And here's an example of a tree in a city in London where I was surveying, where the ground underneath was just full of rubbish. It often is. I spend many an hour on a building site in London watching holes being dug, and what you see underground is well, it's just astonishing, and it's rarely healthy. So the tree roots are just twisting and turning. They'll be shallow, or they could be very deep in fissures, underground structures. They could be growing right next to an old foundation, anything where they can get water, nutrients, air, and actually get a purchase against something hard so it can lean against, so it doesn't need to grow as much, like a support system. The other thing about tree roots is that they obviously not only get longer, but they get fatter. And if you cut through a tree root, it will have rings, but they don't match the rings of the trunk. They tend to be less of them. And also they tend to be elliptical, being fatter at the top, where the soil is easier to grow through and a bit thinner on the bottom. But tree roots also adapt their environment as well as adapting to it. So some trees actually fix nitrogen into a stable, fix the gas of nitrogen into a stable mineral. And they do this through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that live in root nodules. And so the tree benefits from a real boost of nitrogen, so it can grow well, often in quite poor soils. Often these are in wet soils, in poor conditions. And the bacteria go, thank you very much, I'll have some amino acids. And actually this has led to some recent farming practice. Well, actually, it's probably only a repeat of what used to happen hundreds of years ago, where nitrogen fixing trees are planted near arable crops. So those arable crops benefit from the nitrogen and from the shelter and from the fact that tree roots also control soil water levels. Tree roots will also tell you if they just want to survive. So some trees like poplars, if you cut them down or chop their roots, they are going to grow thick and fast. And that tree root is going to push through whatever's in its way. But rather beautifully, trees that fall over will then live on through adventitious roots. So this is what we call a harp tree. So if you imagine all these vertical trees here growing from the bottom, and it's a wonderful way of preserving genetic code. And these tree roots will often be grafted, sharing water and resources, but also, sadly, sharing pests, sharing fungal and diseases as well. So it's not all win-win. Well, not shown in this photograph, but really the main way of some species propagating is vegetatively, I can't say that word, where the stems of poplars and willows will break off, go downstream and root. And this lovely old veteran lime tree has walked across a historic landscape by branches sweeping down and rooting. This again is a wonderful way of preserving the old genetic code of this ancient tree. It happens naturally and creates an enchanted landscape. A less friendly way is by a chemical. So some trees do not want to have their friends around them. They will push them away through a chemical thing in the roots. And examples of this are laurel, sumac, rhododendron, walnut, and tree of heaven. If you've ever been to a woodland and you've seen loads of rhododendron, it generally goes mad, and it's a real nuisance because it's shading out the important ground flora. And in my youth, I would go on rhododendron bashing holidays. So if you thought I was weird already, but it's really important to recognise that some trees do this and it can affect the ecology. It's a natural process. But where do trees root? We're doing stuff to our land all the time, and we need to protect our trees. So understanding how far trees root is really important. So this is an example of a study we carried out on an oak tree, where we used tree radar, more of which in a moment, and we found out that tree was rooting well beyond calculations that where it could be, but actually out to 23 meters. And when we scanned, had the privilege of scanning the root protection area of the major oak, which you may have heard of in Sherwood Forest, the tree was rooting out to 42 meters in one direction, not all the way around because there was competition from other trees. But these ancient and veteran trees are really sensitive because as trees get older, they are less resilient and they have centuries-old relationship with their unique ecosystem of soil microbiomes and mycorrhizae. So you start mucking around with the edges of the root system, it can be difficult to get the tree to cope. So for those arborists amongst you, or arboriculturists or tree folk, whatever you want to call yourself, because we have an international audience here, which is fabulous. In the UK, we have a system we use where we're thinking about building near trees, where we work out a root protection area. And it's been widely understood, which is useful. It's a mathematical calculation. Measure the stem up 1.5 meters, take the diameter, times it by 12, and you've got the circle with a radius of, let's say, if it's a 1 meter diameter, 12 meters. This isn't actually saying where the roots are, but it's saying where a useful root space is. And it's normally a bit bigger than the crown of a normal shaped tree. And it's not a bad stab at where trees are actually rooting, but the finer stuff is on the outside. So I think it's fairly good. But for our ancient and veteran trees, we look at a 15 meter time calculation. So on that tree, it would be a 15 meter radius. We have, as I said earlier, found trees much further. But maybe you don't want to go to that trouble. You just want to understand if you're looking at an old tree or any tree, how far it's rooting. Don't dismiss your own gut feeling, your own knowledge, and your own common sense about what's growing around. But sometimes we really do need to know. It's really important. So there are various methods, one of which is digging a hole. You know, a few trial pits, carefully dug, not chopping through the roots, in areas where you need to know what's going on, is a really good method. We know probably if you're going down about 900 millimeters, you're probably going to see most of the roots. So I'm not dismissing that, but just make sure you cover up the hole right away because the tree roots will die off, the fine ones will. Another method is air spading. This is, I used an air spade for a very long time. Very fast air, very noisy, very messy, huge fun. And what this does is it blows away the soil and you can see the tracery of roots underneath. This is where it's worked super well, where, just checking the time, where tree roots are wrapped up in hessian, and in clay soils, it doesn't work so well. So if you don't want to dig up and you don't want to air blast, you can use tree radar, which is a ground penetrating radar scanning tree roots as thick as your thumb down to 3 meters. It's a very useful tool that can produce a 3D map and plans and trenches, which will show where the tree roots are of that size and above. Won't tell you how thick they are. We ground truthed this a lot in Europe and in the UK, and we refined it, and it was complicated when we got there. And a recent study by a dear friend has been able to use this so that they can plan a really useful raised footpath in the area where the tree roots are fewer, which is shown by the white gaps here. But tree radar won't find the fine stuff. So I'm going to skip this slide because this is going to be available, but there are many, many methods of how you do it. But believe me, tree roots can be killed. And this is one of my construction sites where the soil has been poisoned and compacted. And compacted soil is bad. It will kill the air spaces, stop the water from getting down, stop the roots from growing and breathing. And you'll see that in the crown by smaller, yellower leaves, areas of dieback, and it's a total shambles. Another area where tree roots are killed is simply by trenching. This is a before and after with the tree dead on the right-hand side. Another problem is de-icing salt, where salt massively disrupts the biological processes of roots. And sometimes you will see by the road trees with dead branches on the roadside near a salt bin. The tree just simply can't cope. And herbicides and other chemicals can also cause a problem, not just for the tree directly, but for the soil ecology underneath. Why do we do this? Stop it now. I don't need to say anything. And tree roots are also damaged by inappropriate root pruning, lifting trees. And this horrendous example I found out about on Sunday, where sacred baobab trees were being shipped to Georgia in USA with no thought of anything but even just technically chopping through the roots, and that's now been stopped. But how do roots harm? We've talked about the good stuff, but they also can be, to some people's mind, nuisance. So in a city, I love what John said about tree roots listening to water. Well, tree roots will actually grow around pipes and grow in a crack and expand and can cause a problem. They also lean against the pipe, but this diagram shows the complex of our city scapes underneath the ground. But all of this is avoidable. There are wonderful techniques now of planting trees in crates, of using root directors, of properly planning. So there are some retrofitting of our city landscapes to make sure that everything can fit together. But we have a long legacy of chaos underground. And actually it's remarkable that more damage isn't done. Tree roots can be damaged by fungi, they can be severed, and it can lead to catastrophic consequences, which is why the skill of tree experts to have a look at the condition of the tree is really important. But that's a whole subject for another seminar. And tree roots also cause direct damage by getting fatter and lifting things up and pushing things away. They also cause subsidence by those fine roots drinking water from a shrinkable clay in summer, leading to foundations to fall and then re-wet in the winter and become stable. So subsidence is often blamed on trees, sometimes rightly so. And even if trees aren't guilty, they often take the punishment and are removed. The reality, this is a massive subject, but there are solutions. First of all, buildings need to be properly designed, trees need to be planted appropriately, but if that hasn't happened, there are root barriers, and there's also underpinning. A massive subject I am skirting over. So how can we help our roots? Well, one of the really important functions is nutrient recycling. So falling leaves fall down and recycle their nutrients to the roots, and our cities and towns are too tidy for that. But what we can do is we can mulch with wood chip out to the drip line, but not right up to the trunk, about 75 millimeters deep. This will stimulate that ecology that we talked about as everything sort of travels down and earthworm activities increase. It will also keep the weeds out and keep the moisture in. It's absolutely a wonderful, simple technique. Slightly higher up the scale is compost tea, and I recommend Soil Biolab for more information. And the new kid on the block, which has been around for millennia, is biochar. Biochar is carbon, which is really porous, packs in those micronutrients, absorbs water, resists compaction, and really helps as a big support system to tree roots. It's being used on top of tree roots within new planting, and the studies in the last 10 years have been very clear that it greatly assists the benefit of planting new trees. And you can buy them in bags, grab a handful or two, put it in the planting pit, and it's made a real difference. It's also good, in my opinion, for urban tree situations when the soil is poor. There's a company called Apex Arboriculture, which has taken this a step further, and it uses a geo-injection system to pump this into the ground. And it's been very successful. But I would say that the evidence is there, but there is discussion on what is appropriate. So if you think of the soil ecosystem as being complex, if we are introducing mycorrhizae, do we know what we're doing? If we're in a very sensitive area, there is a school of thought that we need to be more cautious. I say, let's consider where we are and what the problem is. And first of all, we should prevent any damage, protect what we have. And if you see a sickly tree, let's think about what's going on carefully, reflect upon that, and then plan appropriate treatment. If you can, plant trees in groups to be friends together and promote good root care. Thank you very much for listening. I'm now going to stop sharing. Whew.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you indeed. We have lots of questions. We do have, as you said, we've got a very international audience tonight.
Yes, wonderful.
We've got people from Bermuda, the States, Ireland, all sorts of places. So we apologise if we were a bit Anglo-centric in some of that for you folk abroad, but hopefully we might be able to pick up on any of those questions. So we've got a few questions that we'll start with. Simon asks, when planting a root balled tree, but in planting any tree, do you think it's better to use round holes or square holes when we're digging for roots? Now I have an opinion, but I'll let you have a go too, Sharon, first.
I love that question, and thank you for that. Square holes. The reason why is that tree roots have been generally growing in a pot or in a root ball. Of course, some are bare roots, and so they will naturally want to go round and round. And if you have a round hole, they hit the side and they go round again. And the problem with that is it discourages the lateral root growth, and it can lead to stem girdling, which is when a root is growing around a stem like this. Oh, it can't breathe properly or get the water. Square holes are best and rough up the sides.
Okay. Now I take a slightly different opinion.
Oh, go on then.
Well, it's only if you're planting, the question specifically asked root ball trees. So under those circumstances, but if you're planting bare root trees, as we're planting often small ones at this time of year, particularly as it's National Tree Week, I'm not so sure it matters. And there was a report that was done back in the 90s where they dug round holes and square holes and even star-shaped holes to see whether the roots made any difference. And it's the only paper I've ever seen that actually looked at it in bare root trees, and they couldn't find any difference. So I'm not sure the evidence is there, but it makes a lot of difference for small bare root stuff that has come out of the ground. But certainly if you've got root ball stuff that's had a lot more treatment, then I think I agree with you, Sharon. There's definitely logic then to thinking about not round.
Well, thank you very much. That was interesting. I'm glad I wasn't the person digging a star-shaped hole.
Exactly. So we've got another question. Let's take one from the United States. If you've got questions, folks, please do pop them in the chat. Sorry, not the chat, in the Q&A. We've got lots of them coming in there. We had a question from the USA, and it's the first time I've ever been able to say, I think, we have a question from the USA. So I'm going to take it from Julie Beer. She said, is the UK experiencing drought? Here in the Western US, they've been having drought for many years, causing massive fires, redwoods, impacting redwoods and others. The answer is yes, Julie. We have been having, certainly this year, we've been having drought. We've been having drought that's been particularly problematic amongst newly planted young trees. We've lost quite a lot in new planting this year because we haven't got our technique up together as much as we should for drought conditions. It hasn't been something that's been particularly prevalent over the previous few years, but with climate change, we just don't know. However, Sharon, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, we're all experiencing climate extremes. And here in the UK, we had our first over 40 degrees centigrade and a long period of drought, which of course is going to affect everything. But I mean, it may not sound very hot to some of you, but it was for us.
And we need to think more closely about some of our planting techniques to protect those roots from drought going forward. So some of the things Sharon's been talking about dealing with mulch and with all of that sort of thing, that's what we need to become better of as a nation here. We've had a question from Diane who's asked if you could repeat your formula for root protection
Oh,
zones?
yes, of course.
Please?
So if you measure up the trunk of the tree about this sort of high, 1.5 meters, so round about, we say breast height. So get a tape measure, go around the trunk, and if you've got a normal tape measure, that will give you the circumference or the girth. And what you need is actually the diameter. So do the sum with pi to work out the diameter, and then you times it by 12. So let's keep it simple. Let's say the diameter of the tree is 1 meter, times it by 12, and that gives you 12 meters. And that is a radius of a circle, which is called the root protection area. So I'm trying to think of an easy way to give you a link. So if it's 0.5 meter, root protection area radius is going to be 6 meters. So it's times 12, but for veteran trees, times 15.
Dom, I don't know if you can find a link, if you can find the root protection area formula and stick a link in for Diane in the chat, but we will supply it as part of the follow-up from this, if you didn't get all that, Diane. Sharon Hanson, I think Sharon's, Sarah Hanson, I think Sarah's Reading, local authority, Reading local authority. She's asked a slightly more technical question, which says, BS 5837, will you be inputting into the proposed revision, in particular in relation to root protection areas?
Oh, thank you for that question. I'm actually on the panel. So I'm on the BS 213 committee and on the subcommittee for the 5837 revision, which is just starting, but we just welcome everybody's view on that. So we really, it's actually the initial scoping document is out for consultation now, but one of the things we've talked about is, of course, looking at rooting areas and taking care of the rooting environment. Excellent question.
So we've got a series of questions about what's our take on air pots in relation to roots. What about air pots, Sharon?
I'm not the best person to speak to about that. I only have some working knowledge of it. So, because I've not worked in the nursery, but the principle is that the tree roots grow out to the edge of the air pot and they naturally die off. So they're attracted to the light, I believe, and I stand to be corrected. And so what you get is a really fibrous root system. There are many different methods, like there's a Barch and White bag, which also encourages and then, roots out. But no, I'm not the right person to ask folks, sorry.
Well, you don't know till you ask, do you, Sharon? So, so we've dealt with that one. Now, where else should we go next? Looking for one we haven't sort of covered. So Susan linked again to root protection areas. She said, what is meant by a root protection area? No parking, no paths, no roads?
Right, good question. Root protection area is the ideal area that should be preserved. What happens in very high density developments is that often something might need to happen in a root protection area, and there are root friendly methods of doing things. So for example, a path or even a driveway could be over the root protection area if it doesn't dig down into the soil but actually goes on top, and that the method that you use doesn't squash the soil. So there are systems which actually manage the potential for soil compaction, allow water to go down and air to go up and down, and make sure that the soil doesn't squash underneath. There are different things, and generally cellular confinement systems, not a very catchy name, but that they do work if they're installed correctly, and no dig actually means no dig. So there's solutions. There's also solutions for specialist structures. If you map the tree roots, say using one of the techniques that I discussed, then you can find where the main roots are, and you could put in sort of steel screw piles or something in between the roots. Maybe you want to build a wall or a low-rise building, and you can actually spike into the ground between roots, put in a steel lintel, and then have a gap underneath about that much for sort of airflow, and then put your structure above so that everything is sort of supported between roots. So there are things available, but not all the way around the tree. Oh, it's loads. I could talk about that all night.
I know, Sharon. The trouble is there's so many fast and furious questions, and theoretically we've only got a couple of minutes left. So Chris Knappman, an old friend who's another consultant, has asked a question for me, actually. He said, tree planting targets, quality or quantity? Where are the trees coming from? And enhanced potential for disease imports with nursery stocks. Yes, Chris, those are all really, really important questions. They are really important questions. If we are to plant that over 60 million trees a year, we have to think about how we're doing it. We have to make sure we don't import diseases. We have to go for quality. We can have an element of quantity. I don't think they should be mutually exclusive. But if we're going to have quantity, we need to have quality quantity, if that makes sense. We've got to do it right. And that is going to mean that we've got to think more about the roots and the rooting conditions and where we're planting and all the stuff that Sharon's been talking about this evening. So we need, as an industry, we need as tree people to get better about all of this stuff and just have thought it through in a way that means that we're not importing the next pest and disease, and we are ensuring that our trees get planted properly. It's not really, I'm not going to go further with that one, Chris, but yes, you're right. There are lots and lots of things that we should think of there.
And may I add to that very briefly that there is a problem with people going into industry, problem with people, not enough people working in nurseries, and the Institute of Chartered Foresters is working hard with a new nursery group to try and make things better. So there's an issue of supply chain, an issue of land, an issue of aftercare, an issue of let's just grab the headline numbers, bang the trees in the ground and walk away.
Yeah, and we've got to, it's not just about planting, it's about actually establishment. It's about making sure they arrive and grow and become what they should come. Last one, and I'm afraid we are up against the time, everybody, but it's a nice one for Sharon to end in. Can you tell us what a tree consultant does and how you become one?
Oh, lovely. Well, first of all, what a tree consultant does is very varied. So most tree consultants work in a number of different fields. I work in construction, so I look at trees, see if they're healthy, do detailed tree surveys, work with a design team, and write a technical report to make sure that good trees are kept and cared for development, and that there's room for other trees to grow. And I liaise with the local authority. You can also work in tree health and condition surveys, either looking at individual trees in great detail or whole tree populations such as street trees. You can also manage an arboretum. You can be a specialist in subsidence, a specialist in many different things. It's a fantastic career. I suggest you go to the www. Who says that nowadays, apart from old people, trees.org, which is the Arboricultural Association, who are excellent, are giving like a really good career path as a beginning. And also the Institute of Chartered Foresters when you've got a bit further on down the line. If you're interested in working with trees, listen to tree things, read around, go to webinars and speak to tree folks. And yeah, so much to say in about a minute.
I'm sorry, Sharon, I shouldn't have given it as your last question.
No, I want to help, that's all.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all for being there this evening. It was our most international and our largest audience I think we've ever had. So thank you for coming to listen to Sharon. Thank you for your interest in trees. Thank you for National Tree Week and for joining us this year. And if you can plant a tree well, please do. We have the launch of a campaign coming up, which is called The Big Give, which is starting tomorrow. So Dom's about to put a mention in the chat. Please do have a look at that. Thank you for your time this evening, and hopefully you can join us on Thursday for our session on tree roots and mycorrhizae, which would be fantastic to see you there. So thank you all, and see you somewhere.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a real honour. Thank you so much.